There is a kind of pain that does not arrive all at once. It enters quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. At first it feels like love mixed with confusion. You tell yourself that the distance is temporary, that the inconsistency means they are overwhelmed, scared, stressed, or simply healing from things they have never spoken about. And because you care deeply, you become patient, you become understanding, you start giving more reassurance, more empathy, more emotional space. You convince yourself that if someone has been hurt before, then maybe all they need is someone who finally refuses to give up on them. So you stay, even when the silences become longer, even when the affection becomes inconsistent, even when your heart begins carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection alone. What makes this so painful is that the relationship rarely feels completely empty. If it did, leaving would be easier. Instead, there are moments, tiny moments, small flashes of warmth that keep your hope alive, moments where they suddenly become affectionate again, moments where they open up emotionally for just long enough to make you believe you are finally breaking through their walls. They hold you closer one night. They say something vulnerable after weeks of emotional distance. They suddenly text you with warmth after making you feel invisible. And in those moments, your heart immediately starts rebuilding all the hope that was slowly collapsing inside you. You tell yourself, see, they do care, they're just afraid. And because you love them, you begin interpreting inconsistency as hidden depth, rather than emotional unavailability. Over time, you stop realizing how much of your emotional life has become centered around waiting for the next moment of closeness, waiting for the next reassurance, waiting for them to become emotionally available in a way they keep promising but never consistently maintain. Your mood begins depending on their energy. One affectionate conversation can make your entire week feel lighter. One cold response can emotionally destroy your entire day. And the terrifying part is that you slowly normalize this instability. You start believing that love is supposed to feel uncertain, that emotional anxiety is proof of emotional depth, that constantly trying to decode someone's feelings is what intimacy looks like. But the truth is, deep inside yourself, you are becoming exhausted. You may not admit it immediately because your hope is still louder than your pain, but eventually the emotional exhaustion starts surfacing in quiet ways. You overthink every message. You replay conversations late at night, trying to figure out what changed. You wonder if you asked for too much, if you became too emotional, too available, too loving. You start shrinking your own needs just to avoid pushing them away. You become careful with your emotions because every time you express hurt, they either withdraw, become defensive, or disappear emotionally. So instead of feeling safe enough to communicate openly, you begin carrying your pain silently just to preserve the connection. And this is where many people slowly lose themselves without realizing it, because when someone keeps pulling away emotionally, you naturally start chasing clarity. You start trying harder, loving harder, understanding harder. You become more patient than you have ever been in your life, because you believe that eventually your consistency will make them feel safe enough to finally love you fully. But what nobody warns you about is how dangerous it becomes when your entire emotional well-being starts depending on the possibility of someone changing one day. The painful truth is that avoidant people often do not create emotional addiction intentionally. Many of them genuinely care. Many of them truly mean the things they say in their moments of closeness. But caring about someone and being emotionally available for them are not the same thing. Someone can love you in the only way they know how and still leave you emotionally starving. Someone can want connection deeply and still panic the moment intimacy becomes real. And when you do not understand this dynamic, you begin blaming yourself for their distance instead of recognizing the deeper emotional pattern underneath it. So you start searching for answers everywhere. You watch videos, you read about attachment styles, you analyze childhood wounds, you try to become more understanding because understanding gives you hope. If you can just understand why they pull away, maybe you can finally stop them from doing it. Maybe if you love them gently enough, patiently enough, selflessly enough, they will finally stop running from intimacy. But while you are trying to heal them, something inside you quietly starts breaking. Because love should not require you to constantly abandon yourself. Yet that is exactly what begins happening. You stop expressing your full emotions because you fear overwhelming them. You stop asking for consistency because you fear seeming needy. You stop expecting reassurance because you are afraid they will disappear again. Slowly, your standards shrink, your emotional needs shrink, your voice shrinks, and the saddest part is that you often call this being understanding, when in reality, you are learning to survive emotional deprivation. At first, the connection may have felt exciting precisely because of its unpredictability. The highs felt intense, the moments of closeness felt rare and emotionally intoxicating. And that is what makes avoidant dynamics so addictive. The human brain becomes attached to inconsistency because unpredictability creates emotional obsession. You begin craving emotional validation the same way someone lost in a desert craves water. Every small moment of affection suddenly feels overwhelmingly meaningful because you have been deprived of emotional security for so long. This is why you cannot simply let go easily, because your attachment is no longer connected only to the person. It becomes connected to relief, relief from anxiety, relief from emotional uncertainty, relief from the fear of abandonment that keeps getting activated every time they pull away. When they return emotionally, even temporarily, your nervous system finally relaxes again, and that relief feels like love. But real love is not supposed to feel like constantly surviving emotional withdrawal. Still, you continue holding on because part of you believes the version of them you occasionally see is the real version, the warm version, the emotionally available version, the version that appears during vulnerable moments, late-night conversations, or temporary periods of closeness, and so you begin loving their potential more than their reality. You become emotionally attached to who they could become if they finally healed, finally opened up, finally stopped being afraid of intimacy. But potential can become one of the most dangerous things to fall in love with, because while you are busy loving who someone could become, reality keeps showing you who they currently are. And reality is often painful. Reality is unanswered emotional needs. Reality is inconsistency. Reality is feeling emotionally alone, while technically still being in a relationship. Reality is carrying conversations, carrying vulnerability, carrying reassurance, carrying emotional labor almost entirely by yourself. But because the potential still exists in your mind, you keep waiting. You keep believing that one more conversation, one more act of patience, one more chance might finally change everything. And months pass, sometimes years. Years spent emotionally suspended between hope and disappointment. Years spent trying to earn a level of emotional safety that should never have required earning in the first place. You slowly become someone who is always waiting for the relationship to finally begin fully, even though you have already been emotionally investing everything you have for so long. What hurts even more is that people around you often do not understand why you cannot walk away. From the outside, they may only see the inconsistency clearly, but they do not see the emotional bond that formed during those rare moments of closeness. They do not see how deeply you attached yourself to the idea that underneath all the walls and distance exists someone who truly loves you, but simply does not know how to show it consistently. So you defend the relationship, you defend them, you explain their behavior, you minimize your own pain. Because admitting how emotionally neglected you feel would also force you to confront the terrifying possibility that love alone may never change this dynamic, and that realization is devastating. Because you genuinely believed your love could heal what wounded them, you believed your patience would eventually make them feel safe, you believed your loyalty would finally convince them to stop running. But avoidance is not healed through someone else sacrificing themselves endlessly. Emotional unavailability is not fixed through another person tolerating pain quietly. Lasting change only happens when someone becomes deeply aware of their own patterns and actively chooses to confront them themselves. And many people waiting for avoidance to change slowly destroy their own emotional health before finally understanding this truth. The painful reality is that while you are waiting for them to become emotionally available, your own heart is becoming emotionally exhausted. Your confidence weakens, your anxiety increases, your sense of worth slowly becomes tied to whether or not you can finally get someone emotionally distant to fully choose you consistently. And without realizing it, the relationship stops being about love and starts becoming about emotional survival. You wake up thinking about them, you fall asleep analyzing them, you measure your value through their attention, and somewhere inside all this waiting, you slowly disappear from yourself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, in ways that are almost impossible to notice at first. You stop checking in with your own emotional needs because your attention becomes completely consumed by theirs. Every interaction starts revolving around trying to maintain emotional closeness, trying not to trigger distance, trying not to say the wrong thing that might make them withdraw again. You become hyper-aware of their moods, their energy shifts, their silences. You learn how to read emotional tension before words are even spoken. And while you are becoming an expert at managing their emotional world, your own inner world slowly starts collapsing from neglect. This is what makes waiting for an avoidant to change so emotionally dangerous. It trains you to abandon yourself while calling it love. You begin convincing yourself that your needs are simply too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too demanding. Because every time you ask for reassurance, consistency, affection, or clarity, it somehow creates distance instead of connection. So eventually you stop asking altogether. You tell yourself that if you could just become calmer, less reactive, more understanding, then maybe things would finally stabilize. But what you are actually doing is slowly conditioning yourself to tolerate emotional deprivation. And the longer this continues, the more confusing your emotions become. Because part of you knows something is deeply hurting you, but another part of you keeps remembering the moments that felt real, the moments where they looked at you with warmth, the moments where they briefly let their walls down and made you feel deeply loved. Those moments become emotionally powerful because they are rare. Scarcity creates value in the human mind, and when affection becomes inconsistent, every small sign of love suddenly feels enormous. You hold on to tiny moments the way starving people hold on to crumbs. That is why so many people stay trapped in this cycle for years, not because they are weak, but because intermittent love creates one of the strongest emotional attachments a person can experience. You are not only attached to who they are, you become attached to hope itself. Hope that things are finally improving. Hope that this time the closeness will last. Hope that all the pain you tolerated will eventually make sense. And hope can keep a person emotionally trapped far longer than reality ever could. But eventually, something inside you begins noticing a painful pattern. Every time intimacy deepens, distance follows. Every time the relationship starts feeling emotionally close, something shifts. They pull away, become colder, need space, act overwhelmed. Suddenly communication changes, their energy changes, their affection fades. And you are left sitting there emotionally confused, trying to understand how someone who seemed so connected to you days ago can suddenly feel emotionally unreachable again. At first you blame stress, then timing, then fear, then childhood wounds, but after enough cycles, another realization slowly begins surfacing inside you. This is not temporary confusion, this is their emotional pattern, and patterns are painful because they repeat, no matter how many deep conversations happen. No matter how many promises are made, no matter how much temporary closeness returns, the cycle always finds its way back again, and every time it does, another piece of your emotional security breaks. You stop feeling safe inside the relationship because stability never lasts long enough for your nervous system to relax completely. You begin living in emotional anticipation, waiting for the next withdrawal, waiting for the next period of distance. Even during good moments, anxiety quietly follows you, because part of you already fears losing the closeness again. So instead of fully enjoying love, you become psychologically trapped in protecting yourself from abandonment. This is why loving an avoidant can feel emotionally lonely, even when they are physically present. Because emotional presence and physical presence are not the same thing. Someone can sit beside you while remaining emotionally unavailable. Someone can tell you they care while still making you feel emotionally abandoned. Someone can love you to the best of their ability and still be incapable of giving you the consistency required for emotional safety. And that contradiction becomes one of the hardest things to accept, because you keep seeing glimpses of the person you desperately want them to become. You see their softness underneath the walls. You see the vulnerability they rarely show anyone. You see the wounded parts of them that learned to fear closeness long before you ever entered their life. And because you see those hidden layers, walking away feels cruel. It feels like abandoning someone who is struggling internally. So you stay longer, you love harder, you become more patient than you ever thought possible, but patience has a limit before it turns into self-destruction. And eventually your body starts carrying the pain your mind keeps trying to justify. You feel emotionally drained all the time, your thoughts become obsessive, your anxiety increases, you check your phone constantly. Small changes in their tone suddenly affect your entire mood. You start losing focus on your own goals, your own peace, your own life, because emotionally, the relationship has become your central source of stability and instability at the same time, and that contradiction is exhausting. You begin feeling trapped between two unbearable fears, the fear of losing them and the fear of continuing exactly like this forever, because deep down you already know something painful. Even if they change tomorrow, you are no longer the same person you were when this started. The waiting has affected you, the inconsistency has affected you, the emotional uncertainty has reshaped the way you see yourself, the way you love, the way you interpret closeness. There is a specific kind of heartbreak that comes from repeatedly feeling chosen and rejected by the same person. One moment they move toward you emotionally, the next moment they disappear emotionally, and every cycle creates deeper confusion inside your heart. You start questioning whether you are lovable enough, whether you are attractive enough, whether you are emotionally safe enough. Because when someone constantly pulls away from intimacy, the human mind naturally internalizes it. You start believing their inability to stay emotionally close must somehow reflect your inadequacy. Even when logically you understand attachment wounds, emotionally it still hurts the same. And perhaps the most painful part of all this is how invisible your suffering becomes to others. Most people only see relationships in extremes, together or separated, happy or unhappy. But they do not understand the agony of emotional inconsistency. They do not understand how psychologically consuming it becomes to love someone who keeps moving toward you and away from you repeatedly. So you suffer quietly. You carry the confusion internally. You smile in public while privately feeling emotionally shattered by another night of silence, another emotional withdrawal, another period of distance you are desperately trying to survive. And yet, despite all this pain, you still cannot fully let go, because your heart keeps remembering who they are during the rare moments when the walls disappear. That version of them feels real to you, the affectionate version, the emotionally open version, the version that makes you feel deeply connected for brief periods of time. So you keep telling yourself that maybe this version is the real them, and the distance is simply fear. But eventually a painful truth begins emerging. A person is not only who they are during their best moments, a person is also their patterns, their consistency, their ability to sustain emotional connection instead of only visiting it temporarily. And this realization changes something inside you, because you slowly start understanding that love cannot survive on emotional potential alone. Potential does not comfort you during lonely nights. Potential does not create stability. Potential does not heal the anxiety created by constant inconsistency. At some point, reality matters more than possibility. And that is where the deepest grief begins, not only grieving the relationship itself, but grieving the future you imagined with them, the future where they finally healed, finally opened up, finally became emotionally available. You mourn the version of the relationship you kept hoping would eventually exist. And sometimes that grief hurts even more than losing the actual person. Still, many avoidants return after periods of distance, and every return reactivates your hope all over again. That is what makes this cycle so emotionally difficult to escape. Just when you begin emotionally detaching, they come back softer, warmer, more emotionally present. They miss you, they think about you, they suddenly communicate more openly, and for a moment it feels like everything you waited for is finally happening. But often what returns is not permanent transformation, it is temporary emotional reconnection, driven by distance itself. Avoidants frequently feel safer, reconnecting once emotional intensity decreases, or once they sense they might truly lose the relationship. So they move closer again emotionally. But unless deeper internal work has happened within them, the same fear of intimacy eventually resurfaces once closeness becomes consistent again. And so the cycle repeats: distance, longing, reconnection, hope, withdrawal, pain, over and over, until one person emotionally breaks beneath the weight of it. And most of the time, that person is the one who kept waiting for change, because eventually the emotional damage stops feeling temporary. It starts becoming part of your daily existence. You wake up anxious before even checking your phone. You replay old conversations while trying to figure out where things shifted again. You become emotionally dependent on moments of relief, because the relationship has conditioned your nervous system to survive on emotional unpredictability. And this is where the truth becomes extremely painful to admit. What you are craving no longer feels like healthy love. It feels like emotional relief from constant uncertainty. Every time they reconnect after pulling away, your body relaxes, your anxiety temporarily disappears, your chest feels lighter again. And because the relief feels so intense, you mistake that emotional release for deep love. But real love is not supposed to feel like finally being allowed to breathe after nearly drowning emotionally for weeks. Real love is not supposed to leave you constantly starving for reassurance, consistency, or emotional safety. Yet when you spend enough time inside an avoidant dynamic, emotional instability begins feeling normal. You start believing the chaos itself is intimacy. You begin confusing emotional survival with emotional connection. And without realizing it, you slowly become addicted to the cycle itself. The reunion moments become intoxicating precisely because they arrive after emotional deprivation. When someone has emotionally withdrawn from you for days or weeks, even the smallest affection suddenly feels overwhelming. A warm message feels life-changing. A vulnerable conversation feels magical. A simple moment of closeness feels powerful enough to erase weeks of pain. But this emotional high is often not created by healthy connection. It is created by contrast. The pain became so heavy that even temporary relief now feels euphoric. And this is why people remain emotionally trapped in these dynamics for so long. Not because the relationship consistently fulfills them, but because the occasional relief temporarily numbs the pain. Your entire emotional world slowly becomes built around waiting for those brief moments of closeness again. And over time, you stop recognizing how emotionally lonely you have actually become. Because loneliness inside inconsistent love does not always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels quiet, functional, hidden beneath routines, responsibilities, distractions, and false hope. You continue talking to them, continue seeing them, continue trying. But deep inside you feel profoundly alone because your emotional needs remain unmet most of the time. You miss being emotionally seen. You miss feeling emotionally chosen without conditions. You miss the safety of consistency. Yet because you care about them deeply, you keep minimizing your own pain. You keep telling yourself they are trying, healing, struggling, afraid, and maybe they are, but your suffering remains real regardless. And one of the saddest parts about this kind of love is how gradually it destroys self-worth. Not suddenly, quietly. Repeated emotional inconsistency slowly teaches you that your needs are inconvenient. You begin feeling guilty for wanting reassurance, guilty for wanting communication, guilty for wanting emotional presence. Eventually, you stop asking for the bare minimum because you fear losing the relationship entirely. So instead of expressing hurt, you internalize it. Instead of setting boundaries, you become more accommodating. Instead of expecting mutual emotional effort, you settle for emotional fragments. And over time, this slowly changes the relationship you have with yourself. You stop trusting your emotions because every time you feel hurt, you immediately question whether you are overreacting. You stop trusting your needs because you have spent so long suppressing them to maintain connection. You stop trusting your intuition because hope keeps convincing you to ignore the patterns reality keeps showing you. And eventually you become emotionally disconnected from yourself while remaining emotionally attached to them. That is the tragedy of waiting too long for someone to change. You slowly lose connection with your own inner stability while trying to preserve connection with someone emotionally unavailable. The painful truth is that many people waiting for avoidance confuse self-abandonment with loyalty. They believe enduring emotional pain proves the depth of their love. They believe staying no matter how much it hurts makes the connection meaningful. But love should never require you to consistently betray your own emotional well-being. There is a difference between patience and self-erasure. Patience supports growth while still honoring your needs. Self-abandonment sacrifices your mental health in the hope that someone else will eventually become capable of giving you what you have already been deprived of for far too long. And this is where many people reach a devastating emotional crossroads, because eventually your heart begins recognizing something your mind kept trying to deny. You cannot heal someone by loving them harder. You cannot force emotional readiness out of emotional fear. You cannot carry enough empathy to heal wounds someone refuses to confront themselves. And once this realization begins settling into your heart, an entirely different kind of grief starts appearing. The grief of understanding that no amount of love can create change inside someone who is not actively choosing it for themselves. You begin replaying the entire relationship differently in your mind. You start noticing how often you ignored your own pain to protect theirs, how often you excused behaviors that deeply hurt you because you understood where they came from. And perhaps the hardest realization of all is understanding that your love was real, but reality still did not change, because love by itself is not always enough to sustain emotional safety, intimacy, or consistency. Healthy relationships require mutual emotional responsibility. And when only one person is consistently carrying that responsibility, exhaustion becomes inevitable. One of the deepest wounds these relationships create is the lack of closure, because avoidants often struggle to fully explain their emotional world even to themselves. They pull away without clarity, disconnect without explanation, return without fully addressing the pain they caused. And this leaves the other person emotionally trapped inside unanswered questions for months or even years. You search for meaning in every interaction. You analyze every memory, trying to locate the exact moment things changed. You wonder whether they truly loved you or whether the entire relationship was an illusion. But closure rarely arrives through endless analysis because the confusion itself was part of the dynamic. The hardest part is that emotionally unavailable people often send mixed signals without malicious intent. Sometimes they genuinely miss you, sometimes they genuinely care deeply, sometimes they truly believe they can handle intimacy until emotional closeness activates fears they have spent years suppressing. And because their behavior contains moments of sincerity, you keep searching for certainty inside inconsistency. But inconsistency can never create lasting emotional safety, no matter how genuine certain moments feel. And eventually the emotional exhaustion reaches a level where your soul quietly begins asking a painful question: how much longer can I continue surviving like this? Because by this point, you are no longer simply loving someone. You are carrying anxiety every day, carrying confusion every day, carrying emotional instability every day. You are constantly waiting for reassurance that never lasts long enough to heal the fear underneath it. And deep inside yourself, a terrifying realization slowly begins surfacing. You have spent so much time trying to be enough for someone else that you no longer know how to simply exist peacefully within yourself. And maybe that is the most heartbreaking part of all, not only losing the relationship, but losing pieces of yourself while trying to save it. Because eventually there comes a moment where the emotional fog finally begins to lift, not dramatically but quietly. Usually during another lonely night, another unanswered message, another moment where you realize you are once again carrying emotional pain alone, while still trying to convince yourself this connection is enough to survive on. And for the first time, something inside you stops asking, how do I get them to stay? And starts asking, why have I been begging for something that should have been freely given? That question changes everything. You begin realizing how exhausted you truly are, not just tired, but emotionally depleted from spending so long trying to earn consistency from someone who could only offer it temporarily. And once you finally accept that truth, the grief becomes different. You are no longer only grieving the person. You are grieving the time, the energy, and the version of yourself who kept believing that if you just loved hard enough, everything would eventually change. But real love is not supposed to leave you constantly anxious, emotionally starving, or questioning your worth. Love is not supposed to feel like something you must earn through suffering. Healthy love feels safe, it feels consistent, it feels emotionally present. And perhaps for the first time, you realize how little you were truly asking for: clarity, reassurance, consistency, mutual effort, basic things. Yet after spending so long inside emotional deprivation, those basic needs started feeling like luxuries. Choosing yourself after this kind of relationship does not feel empowering at first. It feels painful, lonely, unfamiliar, because your mind became conditioned to the cycle of hope, distance, and temporary closeness. But little by little, something begins changing inside you. The mental noise quiets down, the anxiety slowly fades. You stop waiting for the next withdrawal, and in that silence, you begin reconnecting with yourself again. You remember what peace feels like. You remember that your worth was never defined by someone else's ability to love you properly. And eventually you understand one of the most important truths of all. You were never asking for too much. You were simply asking the wrong person for what your heart needed most. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is stop waiting for someone to become the person they have not yet chosen to be. Because the moment you finally stop waiting for an avoidant to change is often the moment you finally begin returning to yourself.